Hi everyone, and welcome to the MIPI Implementation Toolkit. In this presentation, we'll take a look at both the why and the how of implementing the MIPI within your classroom. Before we get going, however, we want to make sure that we look at where the MIPI fits within your mathematics programming and within your quality design and instruction in your own classroom. Of course, within the continuum of supports, the MIPI lands at that universal level. It's a tool for identifying those skills that are lagging either just before you meet your students, just before you start instruction, or just after. And so it doesn't replace the quality formative and summative based assessments you'll be doing within your classroom. Of course, with the MIPI, as with that your formative and summative based assessments, you do have the opportunity to respond in a number of different ways depending on where that is. And of course, MIPI being a universal tool, it will help to both plan that sound instructional design and also to plan those high impact instructional practices such as building academic vocabulary, math talks, mathematical processes, looking at games and activities, opportunities for problem solving, and of course, your own differentiated instruction. Why the MIPI in the first place? Well, fundamentally, the schools have asked for a consistent tool for identifying student lagging skills in mathematics. And as you may know, there is a very limited set of commercial tools available for doing that. And so, supported by Edmonton Public and involving school districts throughout the province, the MIPI was developed by Alberta teachers for Alberta students, and it is available in both French and English. The assessment assesses a limited set of program of studies outcomes identified as prerequisite skills for the next grade. By building strengths in these skills, this frees up student working memory to address higher order thinking tasks such as critical thinking and problem solving. Before we move into the how of the MIPI, we should clear up a few misconceptions. First of all, the MIPI is a universal classroom tool administered by the teacher. It is not an individualized tool to be administered by the learning coach. Fundamentally, the MIPI is a formative assessment tool to identify specific lagging skills. And therefore, it obviously isn't a summative assessment that would be entered into your gradebook. The MIPI is basically a guide to support designing for learning. It does not provide, however, a benchmark or grade level assessment that will tell you at what grade your students are working at. And finally, the MIPI is a tool for identifying skills that need to be supported or retaught at that universal level to ensure student success. It is not a judgment, and this is very important, it is not a judgment of the previous year's instructions. When do we implement it? The MIPI, as I mentioned earlier, is best used either just before or just after you've met your students. It's most effectively administered, obviously, therefore, in the beginning of the year. However, because this is our first time running through it, we are asking that it is administered at some point prior to October 31st for the 2019-20 school year. So now about the how. The assessment should be implemented by the classroom teacher, as we mentioned. If you have a student or students that are on adapted, which is an out of grade level program, they should receive the MIPI at a grade level that they're learning at, not at the grade that their classroom is. We do encourage that you print out the booklet so that the students can show their thinking on the booklet. And of course, that can be a powerful source of evidence to inform instruction and to inform your PLC conversations. Once you've administered the MIPI, the data is then entered into the MIPI spreadsheet, which you can find in this same folder. The spreadsheet will automatically generate a report that will help you with your own planning and with PLC discussions as you meet with your group. Since the MIPI is a formative tool for identifying student strengths and growth areas, calculators and manipulatives are only permitted if required by the student's ILP. If you do have a student that is required to use those tools, this should be taken into account when analyzing the data either individually or with your PLC. Another important piece is that time is not a measured quantity on the MIPI. As such, students should be given the time they require to complete the assessments to the best of their ability. And as you know, time limits can be a source of anxiety and therefore can skew your results. So when you get into the spreadsheet, just a couple of points on this. You'll see a few things on here, a color-coded list of strands, NB for number, PR for patterns and relations, SS for shape and space, and SP for stats and probability. It'll also list which outcome number. And as you look at the key for the MIPI, those outcomes are fleshed out and include the processes as well. The row directly below those will have the correct answer for each question. So question 1 was C, question 2 is D, and so forth. And below that will be a list of numbers saying that out of the information entered, the one student that I've entered, question 1, one person got it right, question 2, one person got it right, etc. When you're entering it, or data, you're going to start on this line directly underneath that number. The number will represent the number of students in your group and can be a good check to make sure you've got everybody. If you leave this line blank, it won't be involved in the calculation. So please make sure you do put something in the student name box. The class, grade 4, or whatever you want to call it, this is for your own purpose. And so it just has to be something that's meaningful to you. For the actual results, you can either type in the student's answer, which I would recommend anyway, because then you can see what are common wrong answers that are being pulled out of it, or simply a Y or X for whether the student got it right or wrong. And you'll see that it color codes based on what you've put in. Green being, of course, questions that they got right, and red being questions that they got wrong. And that'll give a quick at-a-glance view of how your students are doing and students you may want to talk to. To the right of that spreadsheet, you'll see a section that looks something like this, where it'll say that, for example, our entire group, which amounts to one student, got 62%, or 62% of those students got the number sense questions correct. 100% of the patterns and relations were correct. 60% of the stats, or sorry, the shape and space were correct. Johnny himself, 62% of the number questions he got correct, 100% of the pattern questions he got correct, and 60% of the shape and space questions. The color coding is just for a quick, easy glance and will be green for 50% or higher of questions scored correctly and red for less than 50% of the questions scored correctly. And this will self-populate based on what was on your original spreadsheet. Finally, how are we going to use the results? Well, as a group, as you're meeting with a PLC, if it's a grade level PLC you're meeting with, you might want to look at which outcomes were addressed by the MIPI and how do they map to the outcomes we're teaching this year. What are consistent processes that students struggle with? You may want to ask, are there any consistent incorrect answers? What does this tell you about student understanding? For vertical groups where you're meeting across grade levels, are there any outcomes that are consistently lagging? How can that inform curricular mapping between grades? Is there consistent vocabulary that students struggle with? You might also want to look with both sets of groups, are there consistent interventions that might help to address these lagging skills? In your own classroom, you might want to ask the questions of, are there key outcomes that lots of students struggle with that need to be addressed using universal strategies? Alternatively, are there outcomes that only a handful of students struggle with that might be addressed with classroom targeted interventions? Finally, what do we use this data for? We are asking, of course, that you send in your spreadsheets by November 1st at the latest. The spreadsheets will be combined to build an aggregate total that identify if there's any areas that the students within Foothills struggle with consistently. It's going to provide us with a bit of a baseline, and it's going to help us to build our own support systems and structures moving forward so that your students and yourselves as teachers are supported working through this. We will not be identifying teachers. We will not be pulling out specific classes. We might look at individual communities that or individual schools to see if there's places we can help support, but we're not going to start pointing fingers. That's not what the purpose of this data is for. If you have any questions, either for myself or our curriculum and instruction facilitator, Shelley Reed, please feel free at any time to give either one of us a shout. Thank you very much for paying attention.